Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back here to another edition of Advanced Bass Fishing, and thanks for tuning in for this week's video. Much appreciate it, and hope you guys are enjoying the new channel. If you've been a subscriber for a while, and if it's the first time to the channel, welcome. And I'd like to invite everybody to subscribe to the channel and check out all of our videos. It'd be much appreciated. Guys, today we're going to give you an in-depth, comprehensive little seminar on swim jigs. Now, we did a pitching and flipping seminar a few weeks ago, and we're going to cover all the different jig categories like flipping and pitching jigs, swim jigs in today's video, finesse jigs, football head jigs, because man, jigs are without a doubt, no doubt in my mind, in the top 3 lure categories for catching fish. So in today's video, what I'm going to do, guys, we're going to break down, everything about the swim jig construction themselves, as far as how to build one, how to put one together, when you want to use certain colors and weights and trailers combined together. And then we're going to have part of this, the second half of the seminar is going to be on where you want to fish them, different type of retrieves that you use on their equipment and that type of stuff. So it's definitely one of my favorite ways to catch a bass, guys. If you've never caught a bass on a swim jig, you're in for a treat, because well, I'm sure, if you're an advanced fisherman watching this, you caught them on it, but you guys know what I'm talking about. If you caught fish on swim jigs, you know how fun it is to catch them. Also, guys, before we get started, I just wanted to invite everybody and ask everybody to please check out all the links in the description of this video. If you guys like the content of Advanced Bass Fishing, the seminar format, and you want to support the channel, one of the best ways you can do to give back a little bit for this information is to support all those links. So it's like the lake map breakdowns I do, the virtual lessons, solar bat sunglasses, bait works, and my on the water lessons, all that. I'll put the links for all that will be in the description of the video if you guys would like to visit that and support it. Much appreciated there. Okay, guys, I'm going to start out a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about the history of the swim jig, and then we're going to get into the actual jig itself. I think that looking back on it, my generation was sort of the one that discovered the swim jig by accident. Now, I'll tell you what it was the first time that I had really figured out. At the time, they didn't even have swim jigs. There wasn't a lure category called a swim jig. It was just all flipping and pitching jigs back then. And I was at a tournament down at Lake Dardanelle. This was been back around, man, it had to be close to 30 years ago at Lake Dardanelle. And I was pitching and flipping shallow grass with my traditional, 1 ounce jig with a big pork frog on it, #1 pork frog, flipping and pitching the holes in the grass. And this was a summertime tournament at Lake Dardanelle, which now is famous for being a swim jig lake. Back then nobody knew anything about, what a swim jig was. But anyway, in that particular tournament, the first day of the tournament, I wasn't getting many bites pitching that jig in there, but I started noticing it's like I'd flip it in the holes in the weeds, and I'd work it a little bit, and then I'd start reeling it in to make another pitch. And probably 3 or 4 times that day, I had good ones grab the thing while I was reeling it in to make another cast. I wasn't even expecting to catch one. I was trying to get the jig out of the water to make another flip or pitch. So obviously, it didn't take that happening too many times to realize, hey, there's something to this reeling it in presentation. And at first, I just thought it was just like a fluke. It was just like, oh, whatever, the bass just hit it, but it's not anything you can duplicate. The next day, I went out there, and what I did is I downsized my jig because my 1/2 ounce was a little too heavy because the water was only like that deep. And I went to a 3/8 ounce jig, and I just started pitching it in there and swimming it. And guys, I started hammering them with that, and just big ones with that. And I used it like that moving forward, and nobody knew what that was, because when I told people I was catching them on a jig, since nobody knew what a swim jig was, they just thought I was flipping and pitching. And anyway, I tried to keep this a secret for a lot of years, and it slowly started to get out. People, your co-angler started, saying, hey, Randy wasn't flipping that jig. He was reeling this jig in, just like a spinnerbait or something. So the word gets out, and that's what happened with the swim jig, is it slowly got out, and eventually, over the next 20 years, it caught steam to where it became its all full-blown lure category that you see today. So it's a little history on it with that. So what I want to do, guys, is first of all, I want to talk about the jigs and specifically, and then I want to talk about where you want to fish them. First of all, the swim jig, when you look at a swim jig, it's completely different. And also, guys, the only swim jig I use is this Megabass Uzo swim jig. This is the best swim jig in my opinion. It's got a nano hook in it. It's got a nice nano needlepoint hook. You know, it's got a fine weed guard. It's got an incredible keeper here. Once you put your keeper on it, it never comes off. It has a blade for an extra attractant. Sometimes I cut the blade off depending. But anyway, the difference between a swim jig, like I said, it's the conical shaped head on it, which is designed to reel through the water. It doesn't have the football or rounded head to come over objects. So this head design is a poor head design for rock or wood, but it's excellent to come through grass and stuff like that where it doesn't roll. And then with a swim jig, a little bit different. Most of the time you're using some type of a curly trailer for the action, but that's the basic. We'll get into that a little bit more. But what I want to do is I want to run through specifically the type of jigs I use, size-wise and color, and sort of like put them in a category of their own, talk a little bit about that. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about the size of swim jig before we get into anything else. Now, here's the two most common sizes that I use right here. This is a 1/4 ounce swim jig and this is a 1/2 ounce. Now, they make them in different sizes. Swim jigs come anywhere between 1/8 ounce up to 3/4 ounce, 3/8, all that type of stuff. But for practical purposes, guys, I find out I either want a little heavier one with a 1/2 ounce or I want a light one with a 1/4 ounce. Now, the times that you want a light over the heavy, it has to do with several different factors. First of all, probably the main thing it has to deal with is the water depth that you're fishing. The water depth really dictates a lot of how heavy or how fast you want to move that swim jig in correlation with the water temperature and the water clarity. Those are factors too. But the water depth to me is a big critical factor because if you are fishing a swim jig in shallow water, which you do most all the time, the type of cover you're fishing in relationship to the water depth has a lot to do with your rod position and how fast that lure is going to come through the water. And if I'm fishing water that is, say, less than 2 foot deep, which in dirty water conditions, I fish a lot with a swim jig, I want a light swim jig. I want like a little 1/4 ounce swim jig because when I'm using a 1/4 ounce, it allows me to be able to fish that jig really slow and really shallow in that shallow water. Based upon my rod position, if I hold my rod position high and I've got heavy line on my rod, if I'm using a 1/4 ounce jig, I can keep that bait close to the surface even if the water is this deep right here. So that's a critical aspect of it. Now the other aspect of it too is the water visibility that you have and the water temperature that you have. One of the things that you're going to find out a lot in swim jig fishing is the dirtier the water, the slower the presentation you need on your swim jig. And as the water gets cleaner, sometimes you have to speed that up a little bit. So if I'm fishing also dirty water, like water visibility of under 12 inches, it's more specifically water visibility of like under 8 inches, this is another time I'm using a light swim jig because in that dirty water, I want those fish to have time to find that jig. Since there's not a visual strike to it, they've got to actually, feel that water displacement and the vibration coming through the water, be able to track that. And in that muddy water, by using that lighter jig, I can slow that bait down and keeps it in the strike zone a little bit longer. So that's another aspect with it. And again, in cooler water, that's another factor. I don't use a swim jig a lot in cold water. Most of the time, for the most part, I don't use swim jigs until the water temperature starts to hit about 60. But again, if that water temperature is a little cooler down towards the 60, sometimes the lighter jig works better. Now the 1/2 ounce model, it's just pretty much the opposite of that. It's pretty much a 180 with that. I'll use the 1/2 ounce model at number one if the water's a little bit cleaner. Now say for example, if I'm fishing Lake Tahoe in Florida, Lake Tahoe's got pretty clean water and it's got a lot of vegetation in it. A lot of times in that cleaner water, you want that heavier head in there because you're reeling this bait faster through the water column. Because in the clear water environments, you don't want the fish to have a chance to get a good look at this jig. So the 1/2 ounce allows me to keep the bait higher and reel it faster without it blowing out over the surface. Another time I use a heavy jig is if the wind's blowing extremely hard. Say I'm out there in one of those days, the wind's blowing 25 miles an hour, half-ounce jig will allow me to, keep the bait in position a lot more. And the last time, the other time, or the third time that I use a heavy jig is if I'm using a more of a bulky trailer, a trailer that really, displaces a lot of water, like a big wagon, a flapping trailer on there, and something that's pulling this bait quite a bit. And also, if I want the bait to have a lot of action, because what happens when you got a heavy swim jig, like a half ounce, you can really shake that rod tip like that, and the jig will bounce up and down like that. Because if you're using a light jig and you pop that rod tip, it's gonna be a lot more dead, because you're gonna pop it up and it's gonna fall slower. But with a half ounce, when you pop it up and you're shaking it, it goes through the water like that. So anytime that I'm wanting a little bit more aggressive action is when I go to the half ounce on there. Now, also a little bit about the hooks on there. You can see the difference in the hook size. This is a 4/0 hook that is in the half ounce, and it's a 2/0 hook that's in the 1/4 ounce. So obviously, anytime that you go to a smaller size head on there, you're going to have a smaller hook, which normally means your swim jig is going to be downsized a little bit. So that's all relative to that as well. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about skirt colors. I keep it pretty simple in my skirt colors. I've got 3 primary types of colors that I use, and I don't really vary from that very much. If I'm going to vary anything, I'll vary with my trailer color, which we'll get into. But the 3 main colors I have are some type of a shad pattern, some type of a pearl or white like this when the fish are feeding on shad. And then I've got some type of a green or orange, something like this when the fish are feeding on perch, like bluegills and that type of stuff. And then the black and blue is when the fish are keying more on what I feel maybe they're fishing, or keying a little bit more on crawdads, which a lot of times it's a little bit early in the year, but a lot of times the black is more for some specific water clarities that we'll talk about here in a second. But these right here, guys, are the 3 main that I use. These 90% of the time in my fishing. Once in a while, I'll create a color, like I'll hand tie a skirt or something like that, and I'll create a specific color, maybe put some different accent colors in there, but those are the primary ones. Now, matching it up, guys, with the same thing, the way that I match it up is with water clarity considerations and all this type of stuff. And I'll show you my main matchup pairs. So for the black here, the black and blue, my favorite is the black and blue. And the one that I like is a Zoom Z-Craw here. This is probably my favorite swim jig trailer because I like the bulk of the ribs that it has on there, and it has a wagging tail, but it doesn't, these tails, they have a tremendous amount of action, but they don't pull you real hard. In other words, they don't fight you real hard. If you're using a swim jig trailer like a Rage Craw, it has a little bit thicker tails, there's a lot of water resistance in it, but you don't have quite the water resistance with the Z-Craw, and it just looks alive in the water. So if I've got one trailer, this is my favorite. And with the black and blue, I'm either using the black and blue sapphire to match it, or sometimes I'll put a green pumpkin on the back of the black and blue. Now, the time that I use a green pumpkin on the back of a black and blue jig is pretty much in some type of tannic water situation. So that's one of my favorite colors to use in Florida or anywhere you have clear water and vegetation. If you got water visibility of over, say, 3 or 4 feet, and you've got any type of water vegetation in the water, that black and blue with the green trailer on it is a highly effective color on there. Now the white's pretty much self-explanatory. If I'm using a white or shad color, most all the time I'm using some type of a pearl or white trailer. Just trying to make it resemble a shad, pretty straightforward with that. And then on the perch pattern, guys, anytime I'm using a perch pattern, I'm always using a watermelon or green pumpkin trailer, and normally I'm dyeing the tails with some chartreuse or some orange magic marker. So that's the combination with that. So that's pretty much the colors that we're going to go on it. Now, take a little break here, then we're going to come back, talk about equipment a little bit, and then we're going to get into more specifics of where you want to fish it and retrieves and that type of stuff. So I'll be right back. Okay, guys, a couple quick things I forgot here before we get into the retrieves. Another trailer I want to talk about using here that I use a lot is this Zoom Magnum Speed Craw. Now, this is a little bit different. We were talking about the Speed Craw as far as fighting or having more water resistance. This is one of the things about the speed crawl versus the Z crawl, is the speed crawl, the flappers on it, this will pull a little bit more water. So the times that I want to use this right here is if I'm wanting to slow the bait down. Say I'm wanting to keep the bait higher in the water column or slow the fall on it, then I'll use the Magnum Speed Crawl with that. And also I wanted to show you a little modification on this before we get into it, as far as how I trim the skirt and the colors on there. Now here's the perch pattern, Uzo swimmer here, Zoom Z Crawl. First thing I do on this thing is I'll cut off about 1 inch of it or so. And one of the things you're gonna find, guys, is swim jigs work a little bit better if they're compact a little bit more. The compactness of it will get you more strikes. So I'll cut off about 1 inch there and thread it on. And also, guys, you know, I talk about this a lot. When you thread your trailers on a swim jig, you really have to get it perfectly straight down the middle, because if you don't get it really straight, your jig is gonna roll off to the side a little bit. So it really takes some time to get it straight there. So I've got that on there like that. And then see how uniform that skirt is across it? You don't want that. You wanna cut some serrated edges and make it all crazy looking. You know, make some shorter strands, make some longer strands. You don't want anything to look real uniform on there like that. So make it so you got some crazy strands a little bit shorter. And then I'm gonna take my Chartreuse Magic marker pen and I'm gonna just put a little bit, you know, maybe 1/4 of an inch or so up on it. Don't get carried away with the dye too much, because if you put too much dye on the tails, it just doesn't really look very natural. So that's why I really like to use these marking pens, is you can be a little bit more precise. So you can see got a little bit of puff of chartreuse on those tails right there. So you can see this. I mean, this is really perchy looking. I mean, you reel this thing through the water, you know, it looks just like a perch coming through the water. Fish can't resist that there. So that's the setup with that. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about equipment, swim jig retrieves, how you want to fish it, and that type of stuff. Now there's a lot of different varying opinions on as far as the equipment that you want to use with it. A lot of guys like braided line on a swim jig. I do not like braided line on a swim jig, because here's the thing about it. It's like when you're fishing a swim jig, even though the jig is not very far in the water column, most of the time I still have my swim jig anywhere between 6 inches to 1 foot under the water. So I don't want 50-pound test braided line to be showing coming through the water to that jig, even if the water's, I don't care what the water clarity is. So I don't like the braided line. And another thing, I think it's overkill. I don't think you need that, because a lot of times on a swim jig, you're fairly close to the fish or the jig when you get the bite. You simply don't need that much power. The setup I use all the time, guys, is 20 to 25 pound test Seaguar and VizX fluorocarbon line. If I'm using the 1/4 ounce model jig, I'll use the 20 pound test. And if I'm using the 1/2 ounce jig, I'll use the 25 pound test line. And I fish it on a flipping stick. This is the Megabass Alkalies flipping stick. And this combination of this is the same setup that I would flip my jig on, but this combination of the heavy fluorocarbon line and the flipping stick is perfect for swim jig fishing, because number one, you know, I can make the long cast if I have to. Say if I'm fishing over a big grass flat, the length of the rod allows me to make a long cast. It also allows me to take up a lot of line on the hook set. But more importantly, and this is one of the things that you really need to take into consideration when you're fishing a swim jig, because this is how it works good, is you need to fish that swim jig in the same places that you would flip a flipping jig in. And that's why you want to use a flipping stick, because I'll take the swim jig, guys, and I'll pitch it like underneath a dock or something like that. Or if there's a, you know, flooded bush or something like that, and like there's a little alleyway, I'll flip it just like I would a jig like that and start reeling it to it. And by using this flipping stick in lieu of a regular 7-foot rod with braided line, you can put this swim jig into places they don't ever see a swim jig. You can skip it, you can flip it underneath objects, you can put it in real tight cracks, like between, you know, a boat dock and a boat dock, maybe a pontoon that's in a boat dock. And it's just it's the most efficient way to fish a swim jig. So without a doubt, flipping stick, 25 pound test line. Another thing, guys, most of the time, and you can see that I've done with this one right here, I cut the weed guard off, because unless you're actually swimming the swim jig through thicker grass and brush, you don't need to swim a weed guard in it. So if you're fishing it like along the edge of objects, like along the edge of a grass line or along the edge of a stump or a lay down tree or something, you don't need the weed guard on there. Just cut it off like that. It's just in the way for no reason at all. And main thing, along with that, as far as working the lure, the retrieves, and the hook set on it also is also critical. When you make your cast with a swim jig out there, what you want to do is you don't ever want to throw it out there and just start reeling it like that. You want to have the rod tip high, like between 10 to 12 o'clock, depending upon how shallow or how deep you want the swim jig to go. And as soon as that swim jig hits the water, start shaking your rod tip just like that while you're reeling the whole time. And you want that jig to be going, you don't want that jig to be going straight across the water like that. You want it to just to be like almost vibrating across the water like that. So the combination of this jig vibrating as it goes through the water from you twitching the rod tip like that, and the tails moving on the tail there, it creates a tremendous amount of erratic action, and that's what triggers the bite, for a swim jig most of the part. And you get into a rhythm a little bit with that, because as far as knowing how fast to twitch it and how fast to reel at the same time, it's sort of something you get a feel for eventually with that. And finally, as far as with this, the swim jig hook set is another critical aspect, because even though a swim jig has got a small weed guard or no weed guard, for whatever reason, the way a fish bites it a lot of times, you can lose a lot of fish on a swim jig if you don't set the hook correctly. So what happens, guys, if you're out there and you're fishing your swim jig and you're reeling along like that, and all of a sudden, most of the time you can see a fish come up and grab it. If the water's dirty, you'll just feel a bite and the line will start swimming across. But if you're shaking it and reeling it like that, 80% of the time you're gonna see a boil behind the fish. And when you see that boil, don't get excited, don't reach down and jack the hook and slackline them. When you see that boil, just lean into the fish a little bit, let them have some line, let them move with it a little bit like that, and then just pull into it and start reeling and keep them coming all the way to the boat. We talked about this on some other baits too. Reel, let the pressure of the rod, where you don't set the hook on it, you're just pulling back and reeling at the same time, and keep reeling is the key. You don't want to let up on that as long as the fish is coming to you. The only time that you want to let up on reeling fast is if that fish is coming to you and it makes a turn or it keeps going down the boat. And then at that point, you push the thumb bar on your reel and let the fish go wherever they want to until they start moving back around and start reeling them back to it. In other words, try to visualize, you want the fish's head moving to you all the time. If the fish's head is moving away from you, don't ever try to reverse the direction of that fish's head, because what will happen is you'll rotate that hook in the fish's mouth and you'll lose that fish more than not. So that's a really critical aspect of fighting that fish there. So anyway, okay, we covered the lures, covered a little bit about the equipment, retrieve. Now we're gonna get into the areas that you need to fish a swim jig in, what you need to look for, environmental conditions, and really the meat and potatoes of the video. So we'll be right back. Okay guys, now we're gonna get into the specifics of where you wanna fish the swim jig out, the type of areas, and a little bit in correlation with the different seasons, because certain times of the year they're gonna be in different areas and it requires a different approach. So let's talk a little bit about the main season for a swim jig. Now I consider swim jig fishing to be pretty much from right around the time the fish begin to spawn, right around when the water temperature starts to hit 60, down into when the water temperature drops around 60 to 60 degrees in the fall time of the year. So for the most part, you're looking at the key swim jig season is sort of like between maybe April till, the end of October, something like that. That's the prime period. A lot of it depends on, the part of the country you're in. If you guys live in Florida or South Texas, they bite a swim jig all year long. But for the most part, in most areas, that's going to be the swim jig season. So let's talk a little bit about the springtime of the year. Now, the areas that the fish are going to be in the springtime of the year it's pretty extensive as far as the exact locations in relationship to the lake. So, for example, when I start catching fish in April on a swim jig, I'm going to be able to catch those same fish pretty much in those same type of areas up until like August or so. And I'm going to explain why. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. First of all, when you're talking about in and around the spawn, let's say, for example, the fish are getting ready to spawn. Maybe some of them are spawning. Maybe some of them are done or have just gotten done spawning. Sort of that April to May time frame in most part of the lakes. Obviously, this time of year, you want to be in those spawning areas, and that's going to be the big key. So what you want to look for is the flatter type spawning areas where you figure the fish are going to be spawning at, and you also have to have the right combination of cover and water clarity for that to work. So for the most part, you're not going to catch many fish on a swim jig unless you have some type of an ambush point for the fish. In other words, swim jigs don't work very good on bare banks. I'm not saying you can't catch one on it, but very seldom do they work good on bare banks. Most all the time, you have to have some type of object that positions those fish to attack a swim bait or swim jig. So in the springtime of the year, those particular objects need to be positioned in relationship to some type of nearby spawning area or cover. That could be a boat dock, a shallow dock, whether it be a pier dock or a floating dock. It could be a stump, it could be a laydown, it could be some lily pads, it could be some shallow reeds, some shallow grasses, whatever your lake has. That's what they're going to be looking for. And in correlation with that, you really have to have water visibility of less than 15 inches for the most part. Now, if it's cloudy or dark out or something like that, yeah, you might be able to catch them in 2.5 foot of clarity. And if it's real bright out, say for example it's bluebird skies with not much wind, you might be able to catch them in 4 inches of visibility. But your premier water visibility that you're looking for in the springtime of the year is sort of that 12 to 15, 18 inches. That's going to be ideal for that. That is it. When you have that type of water clarity, it's going to put those fish in that water depth that the swim jig targets, because the swim jig, make no mistake about it, it is a shallow water bait, because since it's fairly quiet, you do have a little bit of water displacement, from the bait itself and from the tails. But for the most part, it doesn't attract fish like a chatterbait or spinnerbait or crankbait. So they're not going to come a long way for it, especially at a deeper water. A swim jig is designed to catch bass that are attacking that lure from a horizontal position, that are up in that shallow water. Those fish that you're catching on a swim jig are living in the same depth of the water you're fishing a swim jig. They're not coming up out of deeper water for it, for the most part. So that's what you have to have with that mix. And, the bank composition, it can be a little bit anything. I mean, I've caught them off of sand, mud, clay, rock, big rock, whatever, if you have the appropriate cover. And again, that is going to be when those fish are in those spawning areas. And most of the time what you're going to have is the reason that you're fishing that swim jig next to some type of cover, specifically in the spawn, is that bass like to spawn next to an object. I mean, if you've ever observed bass very close, and say for example you go in the back of the cove and the water's clear, you might see some beds just alone on bare banks and that type of stuff. But more likely, if you have a log in the water or a stump or anything like that, that's what they prefer to be around. So that's why those type of objects are really good when they're in the spawn. Now, the next thing that happens is you have the post-spawn period. Now, these fish are going to react a little bit differently on a swim jig period in the post-spawn. And also, guys, back to the swim jig around the spawn, this is the time of year I like to use the dark colors. I like the black and blue with either the black and blue trailer or the green pumpkin trailer. Sometimes I'll go to a June bug colored swim jig. I'll tie up my own, but I forgot to mention that you'll do a lot better in that time of year in those darker colors, possibly, a solid green pumpkin. But I really like the black and blue when they're in the springtime of the year during the spawn. Now, what happens when those fish get in the heavy post-spawn period and into early summer? This is usually somewhere around the late part of May and on in through like maybe the end of August. The the post spawn in summer is very similar with that. This is when it's all about spawning bluegills. Now, if you guys have watched much my intuitive angling channel, you hear me talking all the time about spawning perch in the summer. I mean, I did dozens of videos referring to spawning perch in the summertime, because you can't discount how important it is as far as positioning shallow fish when those perch are spawning. And this is when a swim jig is outstanding, is when those fish are done spawning and they're starting to recuperate. This is the time of year the bluegill start spawning. And in most lakes across the country, the bluegill will begin spawning once that water temperature reaches about 70 degrees. And they'll spawn all through the summer until it falls below 70 degrees in late summer. And what happens is you've got a percentage of the bass that will live in those areas where the bluegill are spawning, which are pretty much the same areas the bass have spawned in. If you guys have observed spawning bluegill very much, most all the spawning bluegills live in the back part of the coves, the back 2/3 of the coves, just like the bass spawned. So this is where you can find the spawning perch. Now, the difference in the swim jig fishing in the summertime versus during the spring is you can catch them where there's no cover whatsoever, simply because these bluegills, they don't necessarily have to have any type of cover to spawn around. They'll just spawn on bare banks, and they spawn in groups of it looks like honeycomb. If you've ever seen a bluegill nest, there may be 5 to 15 nests right next to each other that are big around as a pie plate. And most of the time they're spawning on flatter banks in towards the back end of the coves. And this is why you can cover water with a swim jig just down the bank without having any obvious cover, but you've got to have shade. The cover that you must have in the summertime is shade. And that's why my favorite pattern for fishing a swim jig in the summer is I go back in these coves about 2/3 of the way back in there, and I cast that swim jig on anything that's throwing off shade. It can be a piece of shade as big as the front of your boat. Maybe there's a tree that overhangs the water and is throwing off a little bit of shade underneath there, or maybe you're next to a boat dock and the sun angle's throwing some shade off the end of that boat dock. This is what you want to look for, because I'm going to bet 90% of my swim jig bites in the summertime come in the shade on bare banks and 2/3 to all the way back in the cove. And these can be some good fish. I mean, a lot of times you're catching 4-pound fish that are after those bluegill in the back of those coves. And obviously, this is the time of year you want to use the bluegill colored swim jig. So in the summertime of the year, that's when I go to my green pumpkins. I like some orange in my jig skirt. I like a little bit of chartreuse in there. And then I'm using the watermelon or the green pumpkin with the chartreuse or orange, trailer on the jig trailer itself, trying to resemble a bluegill. I don't use a shad pattern or a black and blue, hardly any in the summertime. It's all the perch pattern. And the same deal, guys, rod tip high, shaking the rod tip, keeping that jig in sight. And it is, man, I'm telling you guys, it's one of the funnest ways I've ever caught them. When I fished the Bassmaster Classic, it was a Forest Wood Cup. I fished several, the Classic and the Cup, there at Logan Martin in Alabama. I think I fished 2 Bassmaster Classics there and a couple Forest Wood Cups. But I was fishing this one Forest Wood Cup there. We had an August tournament, and I got on a swim jig bite on Logan Martin in August that was freaking unbelievable. It's like the day before the tournament started down there, I had my hook cut off, and I would run to the back of these flat, nothing-looking pockets, and just like I told you, there would be like a piece of shade there, and I'd throw that swim jig up there, and I'd reel it like an inch under the water, and all of a sudden these big ones, these 3 to 5 pounders, would come out of nowhere and just clobber that thing, and I'd shake them off. They'd swim out to the middle of the cove, and did okay in the tournament, but nothing like it was in practice. So that's a really good deal with there. So anyway, this is going to last up, like I said, pretty much until the end of August, till about the first part of September. And then after that, something else happens a little bit. It's a little sort of a transition, which is sort of odd. Once you get into September and that water temperature starts to slowly cool off, and when I'm talking about slowly, I'm talking about, say if it was maxed out, the water temperature was maxed out at 85 degrees in July, or excuse me, in August. Say it's in September or something, or October, and the water temperature's down to the upper 70s or something like that. There's a transition on these fish that bite a swim jig and they go to a white swim jig. This is my favorite time to catch them on a white swim jig, and I'm concentrating on hard structure. What I mean by this is in September and early fall, my favorite way to catch them on a swim jig is I go to like seawalls, I go to riprap banks, I go to boat docks, I go to wave breaks, I go to marina docks, and I swim that swim jig over the deeper water around those hard structures. Probably my favorite way to catch them on it is off the end of deeper marina docks. So the water may be 20 or 30 foot deep, and I'll just take that jig on that flipping stick and I'll pitch it in those slips of the marina docks, and I'll swim it just underneath the float. Same if there's a wave break. If there's a steel wave break or a tire wave break, do the same thing. Doesn't matter how deep the water is. Swim jig is one of the greatest ways to catch them in early fall, a white swim jig around that hard structure. Bridge piers the same way, really, really highly effective for that. And it's really hard to, I don't really know why certain things like that work better at certain times of the year, but it's something that happens from reproducible results. It's something that happens, excuse me, year after year after year, and you start to take note of it, and there starts to be a pattern to that. So that's what I have found out about swim jigs with that. Those are pretty much the seasons I use them in, pretty much the colors and everything. But anyway, guys, it's a technique you need to learn. It's if you're a competitive angler or a serious bass angler, here's what I would rank as far as some of the most important categories. You need to learn how to fish a chatterbait. You need to learn how to fish anything pitching and flipping like a creature bait or a jig. You need to know how to fish a square bill crankbait, and you need to know how to fish a swim jig. Those are some of the most key shallow water baits for quality fish that there are out there. Spinnerbait too. And you've got to master all of them, because there are times where they'll bite a swim jig and they won't touch a flipping jig, or they won't touch a chatterbait, or they won't touch a spinnerbait. It's all based upon the mood and the personality of the fish the time that you're out there. But make no mistake about it, guys, a swim jig is a deadly technique. It's absolutely deadly. It's here to stay. It's a subtle technique. They're stealthy. The bait doesn't telegraph itself a lot. You can make a lot of different modifications to alter the look and the profile and the color of it. And on top of it, it's just fun, man. It's a fun bait to fish. I would put a swim jig definitely in my top 5 of my five favorite lures to get bit on. So anyway, guys, hope you learned something from the seminar there. Thanks for tuning in. Much appreciated. And like I said, we'll be doing a football head jig and a finesse jig seminar coming up down the road. And I really appreciate the support of the new channel, and we'll see you guys next week.